It all happened on a Tuesday in October, the kind of crisp, bright autumn day that usually makes you feel good about the world, where the leaves are turning brilliant shades of red and gold. But not that day. That day, the air in my father's office was so cold it could have frozen fire. The large window overlooking the city skyline seemed to mock the tomb-like silence inside. My father, Richard Jenkins, sat behind his enormous mahogany desk, a throne he had built for himself. He was 62, with a full head of meticulously combed silver hair and a Wharton MBA he wore like a piece of armor. To him, that degree wasn't just an education, it was proof of his superiority. He had built Jenkins Family Holdings from a small two-man operation into a respectable, mid-sized financial consulting firm, and he never ever let any of us forget the sacrifice and genius it entailed. On his right sat my mother Margaret as the official head of human resources. Her role on paper was to be an impartial advocate for all employees. But in reality, her primary role was to be the unwavering advocate for her youngest son, Kevin. Her smile, bright and proud, was aimed solely at him. Kevin sat on our father's left, basking in the glow of parental approval. At 28, he was the golden child, the chosen one. He'd recently graduated with his own MBA from a decent but far less prestigious school. Yet, you wouldn't know it from the way my parents heralded his arrival as the second coming. He had what my father constantly referred to as flair and vision. He was a master of the corporate buzzword, dropping terms like synergy, disruption, and paradigm shift into meetings with the confidence of a man who believed saying the words was the same as understanding them. And then there was me standing before them like a defendant awaiting her sentence. I was the odd one out in every sense, the quiet daughter, the one who hadn't gone for a flashy MBA, but had instead worked her way up, spending the last 4 years, 2 months, and 17 days buried in the company's real engine room. The spreadsheets, the ledgers, the raw data. I was the one who actually understood how the money moved. I was the head of the internal audit team, or at least I had been until that very moment. Richard, my father, began leaning forward. He laced his fingers together on the desk, a gesture I knew well. It was his delivering a verdict pose. After careful consideration, we've decided to make a change in leadership for the auditing department. Kevin will be taking over as head of the team for the Q4 audit, effective immediately. I didn't flinch. I didn't gasp. I just stood there, a statue in a business suit. I could feel the heat from my mother's beaming pride as if it were a physical force. I could see the poorly concealed, triumphant smirk spreading across Kevin's face. He looked like he'd just won a race he hadn't even run. "We need someone with sharper instincts," my father continued, his voice dripping with that familiar, patronizing sympathy that was worse than any insult. "Business is a battlefield, not a library. It requires gut feelings, bold strokes. Kevin has that natural leadership quality. He sees the big picture." The urge to scream was a physical thing, a hot ball of pressure in my chest. I wanted to ask him if seeing the big picture included overlooking the $1 million accounting error I had found last year. A quiet discovery that saved us from a massive IRS penalty and an embarrassing restatement of our earnings. At the time, my father had praised the team's diligence in a company-wide email. But later that day, he had pulled Kevin aside and congratulated him on fostering a culture of excellence. Kevin hadn't even known about the error until the email went out. But I knew from long, painful experience that arguing with my father was futile. It was like trying to reason with a hurricane. His reality was whatever he decided it was, so I did the only thing I could do. I gave a single sharp nod. "I understand," I said. My voice was unnervingly even. "Good," my father said, leaning back, visibly relieved by my easy compliance. He hated messy confrontations. "That's the team spirit." I turned and walked out of the office without another word, feeling the weight of their combined gaze on my back. It was a portrait of a happy, successful family, and I was being cut out of the frame. I went to my desk, the spacious one at the head of the audit department, and began packing my few personal belongings into a small cardboard box. My team, the people I had trained and mentored, suddenly found the patterns on their computer screens utterly fascinating. No one met my eye. Their fear was a tangible thing in the air, a warning to everyone about what happens when you fall out of favor. I carried my box of shame to my new assigned desk, a cramped cubicle in a forgotten corner of the office, right by the noisy copy machine. It was a clear and public demotion. As I sat down, the scent of toner filling my nostrils, I powered on my computer. I was no longer the watchdog. I was just another cog. But the instincts my father claimed I lacked were screaming at me. As I logged in, I didn't open the meaningless reports I was now assigned to. Instead, I opened a private folder on my personal drive, one I had labeled simply Archives. Inside was my secret project, the one my father had dismissed as a monumental waste of time. For the past year, I had been painstakingly digitizing decades of old paper contracts, invoices, and financial records. It was a mountain of thankless, tedious work. But as I sat there, banished and invisible, I had a gut feeling, a real gut feeling, not the kind my father talked about. That somewhere in that digital mountain of forgotten paper was a truth they had all missed, and now I had nothing but time to find it. My digitization project wasn't just a project, it was my silent rebellion against the corporate culture my father championed. While Kevin was busy designing flashy PowerPoint presentations about the future of Jenkins Holdings, I was in the building's musty, poorly lit basement storage room, surrounded by history and neglect. The air down there was thick with the smell of decaying paper and the faint metallic scent of the ancient filing cabinets that stood in endless tomb-like rows. For the better part of a year, I had sacrificed my lunch breaks and stayed hours after everyone else had gone home, methodically feeding old documents into a high-speed scanner. It was a lonely, monotonous task. I was building a digital ark, rescuing our company's history from the flood of time and indifference. "Lucas, for God's sake, we have interns for this," my father had said with exasperation one evening when he'd found me down there, my fingers gray with dust. "Your salary is 6 figures. I'm not paying you to be a file clerk. I need you thinking strategically up here." He tapped his temple. He just didn't get it. For him, strategy was an abstract concept born in a boardroom. For me, strategy was impossible without data. Hard, cold, granular data. And our company's most valuable data, the history of our deals, our relationships, our mistakes, was trapped in these paper coffins, waiting to be forgotten. Even some of my colleagues had a laugh at my expense. I remember one of the junior salesmen, a cocky kid named Todd, seeing me come up from the basement one day. "Hey, Jenkins," he called out loud enough for others to hear. "Find any ancient treasures down there? Maybe my missing stapler from 2018? A few people snickered. I just ignored him and went back to my desk. The quiet mockery was just another layer of the isolation I'd grown accustomed to. My sister Sophia was the only one who saw things differently. As the head of marketing, she was creative and intuitive, but she respected my methodical nature. She understood that we were two sides of the same coin. She'd often bring me a sandwich and a soda late at night, perching on the edge of a dusty table while I worked. "You're like a detective, Annabelle," she'd said once, watching the scanner's green light pass over another yellow document. "You really believe there's something important hidden in all this, don't you?" "History matters, Soph," I told her. "Patterns matter. You can't know where you're going if you don't know where you've been." "Well," she had replied, smiling, "I'm glad someone in this family is paying attention to the past. The rest of them are too busy congratulating themselves on the present." She was my only real ally, the only one who saw my persistence not as a strange obsession, but as my defining strength. Now sitting in my loser's cubicle, that project was my only lifeline. It was my secret weapon. It was a world of pure, unadulterated fact, a refuge from the world of opinions and favoritism upstairs. And it was in this world of facts that I first saw the ugly little secret that was eating our company from the inside out. It started, as these things often do, with something small, a new vendor I'd never heard of, Innovate Solutions. The name was generic enough to be meaningless. The invoices were for strategic consulting services, a catch-all term so vague, it was practically an admission of guilt. The amounts weren't huge at first, $20,000, maybe $30,000 a pop, but they were regular, frighteningly regular. An invoice appeared at the beginning of every month, like a subscription fee for nothing. Thanks to my digital archive, I could do in minutes what would have taken days of manual searching. I ran a search for the vendor. Innovate Solutions was registered just 6 months prior to a P.O. box in Delaware. No physical address, no website, no corporate history. It was a ghost. My first instinct wasn't to assume malice, it was to follow procedure. I printed out the half-dozen invoices and took them to James Wilson, the CFO. James had been my father's right-hand man for 30 years. He was a creature of habit, a man who valued stability and process above all else. Surely he would see the red flag. I laid out the papers on his desk. James, I began calmly, I was doing some data cleanup on my own time and came across these. The vendor seems to have no footprint, and the invoices are consistently vague. Given the amounts, I thought maybe we should just do a secondary verification on the services rendered. James picked up an invoice, glanced at it, then looked at me over the top of his reading glasses. His expression wasn't curious. It was weary, tired. "Annabelle," he sighed. "Richard put Kevin in charge of the new vendor approval 6 months ago. You know that. He's trying to streamline things." He pushed the papers back toward me. "It's his area of responsibility now. I'm sure it's fine. The boy has an MBA after all. Let him handle it." He was telling me to stand down. He wasn't just dismissing my concern. He was reminding me of my new diminished place in the company hierarchy. It was another clear message. Your concerns are no longer valid here. Your watchdog days are over. I went back to my desk. My jaw clenched so tight it ached. Fine. If the official channel was through Kevin, then I would use the official channel. I wouldn't go to him in person. That would give him the chance to dismiss me face to face. I would create a record, a permanent, undeniable record. I composed the most careful, professional, and impersonal email of my life. Subject now, query regarding payment patterns, new vendor accounts. I CC'd not just Kevin, but his entire audit team, as well as James Wilson. There would be witnesses. While conducting a broader data integrity analysis for historical archiving, I've identified a recurring payment pattern to several new vendors with limited verifiable corporate history. The consistency and escalating value of these payments are statistically anomalous when compared to our established vendor onboarding protocols over the last 5 years. I recommend a secondary manual review of the associated contracts and service verifications for these accounts to ensure compliance. I deliberately avoided using words like suspicious or fraud. I attached a single clean chart showing the payment spikes over the last 6 months, highlighting their deviation from the norm. I didn't include my opinions. I didn't include my suspicions. I just gave them the numbers, because the numbers don't lie. I hesitated for a full minute before hitting send, my finger hovering over the mouse. This felt like a point of no return. But the image of my father's smirk, of Kevin's smug expression, pushed me over the edge. I clicked the button. For a moment, I felt a small sense of professional relief. I had done my duty. I had logged my concern. I had created a paper trail. Now the ball was in their court. The next day, Kevin called a mandatory meeting for the entire audit department. The meeting was held in the main conference room, the one with floor-to-ceiling glass walls that everyone called the fishbowl. My new role as a junior analyst meant I wasn't required to attend, but my cubicle was directly opposite. I had a front row seat. My heart sank into my stomach when I saw the projector screen. It was my email, my carefully crafted, professional email, blown up for everyone to see. Kevin stood at the head of the queue holding a laser pointer like a weapon. He had a wide, condescending grin on his face. This wasn't a meeting, it was an execution. "All right, team," he began, his voice booming with false authority, loud enough for me to hear clearly through the glass. I wanted to use this as a teaching moment, a perfect example of the kind of old-school bureaucratic thinking that holds companies back. He aimed the red dot of the laser pointer directly at my chart. This is what I call analysis paralysis, getting so bogged down in meaningless micro details that you completely miss the big picture. He paced back and forth. We are in a growth phase. Growth requires speed, agility, and trust in our people. We can't let this kind of paranoid bean counting slow us down. He looked around the room, making eye contact with my former team members. They stared at their notebooks, at the table, anywhere but at the screen or at me. They knew my work. They knew I was never paranoid, but they also knew who was in charge now. Their silence was a betrayal, but I understood it. It was survival. "This analysis," Kevin declared, tapping my chart with the laser pointer again for emphasis, "is a monumental waste of our time. We are focused on strategic initiatives, not chasing ghosts in the spreadsheets. Let's move on to something that actually matters." He clicked to the next slide, a garish graphic with the word synergy in huge bubbly letters. I couldn't watch anymore. I swiveled my chair around to face my own monitor, my face burning with a heat that had nothing to do with the temperature in the room. He hadn't just ignored my warning. He had taken it, twisted it, and used it as a prop in a public performance designed to cement his own authority and ridicule mine. That was the moment everything changed. The part of me that had hoped for a reasonable outcome died. The quiet, diligent daughter who just wanted her father's approval was gone, burned away by the heat of that public humiliation. A new resolve, cold and hard as steel, settled in its place. I looked at my screen, at the gateway to my digital archive. They wanted to ignore the details. They wanted to chase ghosts. Fine, I would become the ghost. I would haunt their spreadsheets. I would learn their secrets. And I would build a case so strong, so irrefutable, that it would shatter their world of blissful ignorance. I glanced across the office, and my eyes met those of Elena Rodriguez, the head accountant. She was a sharp, no-nonsense woman in her late 40s who had worked with me on a dozen complex audits. She had seen the entire spectacle. She didn't offer a look of pity. She gave me a single, almost imperceptible nod. It was a gesture of validation, of shared disgust. It was all I needed. That night, I didn't go home. I waited until the last employee had left, until the office was a sea of dark monitors and silence. Then I walked into the empty audit department conference room, the scene of my humiliation, and fired up the projector. I didn't put up my email. I put up the raw data, the first of hundreds of files I would comb through. "All right, Kevin," I whispered to the empty chairs. "Class is in session." The next 3 nights were a descent into a world of numbers, lies, and lukewarm coffee from the break room machine. The office, once a place of professional pride, became my clandestine headquarters. By day, I was Adabelle Jenkins, the demoted analyst, performing the mind-numbing tasks assigned to me with a blank expression. I ran reports on market trends that I knew no one would read. I updated spreadsheets that were irrelevant. I was a ghost in the machine, and my invisibility was my greatest asset. But when the cleaning crew packed up their rattling carts and the last security guard did his final lazy walkthrough, my real work began. I would slip back into the office, my heart pounding with a mixture of adrenaline and fear, and the hunt would begin. The first night was about establishing the full scale of the bleed. I went beyond Innovate Solutions. Using my digitized archive, I created a program to search for vendors with similar characteristics: new registration, P.O. box addresses, vague service descriptions, and most importantly, invoices that fell just under the $100,000 threshold for Kevin's fast-track approval. 2 more names popped up: Apex Logistics and Synergy Partners. The names were a sick joke. There was no Synergy, no Apex. They were just phantom companies, leeches draining the lifeblood of our firm. I pulled every invoice, every payment record. I laid them out chronologically on the huge conference table. The pattern was horrifyingly clear. It started with a small, tentative test payment of $15,000. When that went through without a single question, the floodgates opened. The amounts grew bolder. $50,000. $85,000. $97,500. My hands trembled as I keyed the numbers into a calculator. The total was already over $1 million, and it was climbing every month. But the numbers weren't the whole story. I needed to understand the how. That's when I turned my attention to the approval process itself. Last year, when Kevin had pitched his new system, I had argued against it, not just to my father, but in a formal memo to James Wilson, the CFO. I had outlined this exact vulnerability. I had warned that removing the mandatory secondary sign-off from the finance department for significant sums was an invitation for abuse. I logged back into the system and found my old memo. Reading it now felt like reading a prophecy. Then I started pulling the digital approval forms for every fraudulent payment. Every single one had just 2 signatures. The first belonged to a mid-level manager named Michael Thompson in the procurement department. The second, the final executive sign-off, belonged to my brother, Kevin Jenkins. Kevin's signature, a lazy, arrogant scrawl, was on dozens of them. He was so high on his own promotion, so eager to look like a decisive, fast-moving executive who wasn't bogged down by bureaucracy, that he had just stamped his approval on everything that crossed his desk. His incompetence wasn't just a character flaw, it was the key that had been used to unlock our family's vault. That first night, I finally stumbled out of the office just as the sky was beginning to lighten from black to a bruised purple. My mind was buzzing with a toxic cocktail of rage and vindication. This wasn't just a simple case of a crooked employee. This was a cancer that had been allowed to grow because of my brother's negligence and my father's willful blindness. As I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, I was torn. A part of me, the daughter, was horrified at what was happening to my father's life's work. But another colder part of me, the woman who had been publicly humiliated, felt a grim satisfaction. They had wanted me to stop looking at the details, and now the details were about to burn their entire world to the ground. The contrast between my silent nocturnal investigation and Kevin's daytime performance was almost surreal. He was a king holding court in a kingdom he didn't realize was bankrupt. He'd stride through the office, barking orders into his Bluetooth headset about leveraging our core assets and pivoting our Q4 strategy. On Wednesday, he bought the entire office gourmet donuts from a trendy downtown bakery, announcing in a loud voice that it was to boost team morale for our incredibly successful audit. I watched him from my cubicle, watching my colleagues thank him, their faces smiling, their eyes empty. I wondered if the donuts tasted like hypocrisy. I saw him in a meeting with Sophia. Her marketing department was genuinely creative and profitable, but Kevin was trying to co-opt her success. He was pitching a full-scale rebranding initiative, complete with a new, meaningless logo he'd probably sketched on a napkin. Later, Sophia stopped by my cubicle, her face a mask of frustration. "I can't take it anymore, Adabelle," she whispered, leaning in so no one else could hear. He spent an hour talking about the emotional resonance of the color blue. Meanwhile, I have 3 major campaigns on the verge of launching, and he hasn't approved the final budgets because he's too busy being a visionary. He's going to sink my entire department with his incompetence. "I know," I said, my eyes fixed on the spreadsheet on my screen that detailed the flow of money to Apex Logistics. "What are you doing here so late every night?" she asked, her voice soft with genuine concern. "You look exhausted. You're going to burn yourself out for a company, for a family that doesn't appreciate you." I couldn't tell her the truth. Not yet. It would put her in an impossible position, forcing her to choose between her siblings. "Just some data cleanup projects," I lied, the words tasting like ash in my mouth. "Trying to keep busy." She squeezed my shoulder. "Well, don't. They don't deserve your dedication." Her words were meant to be comforting, but they echoed the most dangerous thought in my own head. Maybe I should just let it burn. That afternoon, I saw Kevin take his audit team out for a lavish lunch at a downtown steakhouse. I knew for a fact they weren't meeting a client. I later saw the expense report. He had classified the $800 bill under client prospecting. It was a small lie in the grand scheme of things, a rounding error compared to the millions being siphoned out. But it was proof of the same underlying disease, a culture of entitlement and a complete disregard for the rules, a culture that started right at the top. The second night of my investigation was dedicated to the man whose signature started it all, Michael Thompson. Using a combination of the company directory and a few public records databases I had subscriptions to, I started to build a digital effigy of him. On paper, he was the perfect employee. 40 years old, married, 2 kids in a suburban school. He had been with the company for 5 years. A quiet, unremarkable procurement manager who kept his head down and did his work. He was the last person anyone would ever suspect. He was the perfect corporate ghost. But ghosts leave traces, especially in the digital world. I started with the shell companies. Cross-referencing their registration addresses with public property records gave me the first hit. The address for Apex Logistics was a small rented office space in a low-rise building an hour outside the city. I ran a search on the building's owner. It was a numbered holding company. It took another hour of digging through corporate filings, but I finally found the name of the holding company's director, Robert Friesman. A quick search on Friesman revealed his sister's name. It was Carol Thompson, Michael Thompson's wife. It was a thin link, but it was a link. He was using his own brother-in-law to lease the office for his phantom company. Then I turned to social media. Thompson's own profiles were private and locked down, but his wife's were public, and she loved to post pictures. Pictures of their recent trip to Italy. Pictures of their brand new boat, the liquid asset. Pictures of the gleaming black sports car Michael had apparently bought for his 40th birthday. These were not the purchases of a mid-level manager with a $90,000 salary and a mortgage. He wasn't just stealing, he was flaunting it, hiding in plain sight, supremely confident that he was surrounded by idiots. He was banking on Kevin's arrogance and my father's willful blindness. And for 18 months, it had been the safest bet in the world. The total amount stolen was now approaching $3 million, spread out over a year and a half. It was a slow, methodical exsanguination. The company wasn't going to collapse overnight. It was being hollowed out from the inside, leaving a fragile shell that would shatter at the first sign of trouble. The healthy profits my father bragged about at the country club, the generous holiday bonuses, even the money for Kevin's promotion and inflated salary. It was all being subsidized by this massive, ongoing theft. The third and final night was about building the case. I had the data, I had the motive, I had the culprit. But I knew that wasn't enough. I was going up against my own family. Their first instinct, their only instinct, would be to deny, deflect, and destroy the messenger. Me. My report couldn't be just a collection of facts. It had to be an airtight, irrefutable weapon. It had to be so clear, so logical, and so devastating that it would leave no room for argument. I didn't sleep a wink. Fueled by the last of the stale coffee, I worked with a feverish intensity. I created charts that showed the exact flow of money from our company's bank accounts to the accounts of the 3 shell companies. I created timelines that aligned Thompson's lavish purchases and vacations with the dates of the largest fraudulent payments. I wrote out a clear, concise narrative explaining in simple terms how Kevin's vaunted fast-track approval system was the fatal flaw, the open door through which Thompson had walked. And then, for the final brutal touch, I added the evidence of my own humiliation. I printed out my original email to Kevin's team, the one with the cautious warning. On the next page, I placed a screenshot of the internal company blog post where Kevin had boasted about moving the company past the kind of analysis paralysis my email represented. It was a diptych of incompetence and arrogance. I printed every page in high-resolution color. I 3-hole punched each sheet and placed them one by one into a heavy black 1-inch binder, 23 pages in total. The finished product felt like a slab of granite in my hands. It was more than just a report. It was the truth, bound and weaponized. It was my vindication. As the first gray rays of dawn crept through the office windows, painting streaks of light on the conference room table, I leaned back in my chair, my eyes burning with exhaustion. I had done it. I had the entire ugly story. The dilemma that had been tearing me apart for days was finally settled. I wasn't going to my father. I wasn't going to the board. I had tried the proper channels, and they had been used to publicly flog me. I would let them walk right up to the edge of the cliff. I would let them savor the view, believing they were masters of the universe. I would let them feel the ground begin to crumble beneath their feet. And only when they were falling, when they were desperate and flailing with no one else to blame, would I show them the bridge that had been there all along. The bridge they had told me was worthless. The bridge that I had built. A week crawled by, a week of me sitting on a powder keg, waiting for a spark. Every time my father walked past my cubicle, my heart hammered against my ribs. I kept the black binder locked in the bottom drawer of my desk, a dark secret in a sea of beige office furniture. The spark, when it finally came, didn't originate from inside our walls. It came from the outside. A voice of authority that my father couldn't ignore or bully. It came in the form of a phone call to his private line. It was from Victoria Adams. Victoria wasn't just a client. She was a pillar of the financial community, a sharp, elegant woman in her 60s whose firm, Adams Capital, had been one of Jenkins Holdings' first and largest accounts. She and my father had a 20-year relationship built on mutual respect and, more importantly, mutual profit. Her opinion mattered. Her disapproval was a flashing red light on the stock market of our reputation. I was on my way back from the copy machine, my new official hangout, when I saw my father through the glass walls of his office. He was laughing with someone on the phone, leaning back in his leather throne. Then his assistant Sarah buzzed him. I saw him switch lines. The change was instantaneous and dramatic. His laughter died. He sat bolt upright, his relaxed posture vanishing, replaced by a tense, rigid focus. He grabbed a pen. I couldn't hear Victoria's words, but I could see them landing like physical blows. My father's face, usually ruddy and confident, slowly began to pale. He was nodding, but the nods were sharp, jerky, involuntary. He started jotting down notes on a legal pad, his hand moving in a furious scribble. His knuckles were white. The call lasted for what felt like an eternity, but was probably only 10 minutes. When he hung up, he didn't move. He just stared at the far wall, the pen clutched in his hand like a weapon. Then, with a sudden violent motion, he slammed it down on the desk. The sound made Sarah, his assistant, physically jump at her desk outside his door. I didn't need to be a psychic to know what that call was about. Victoria Adams was famously, almost legendarily, meticulous. Her accounting department didn't just balance the books. They dissected them. They would have seen the strange, high-value payments to new, unverifiable vendors. They would have flagged them. And Victoria, being Victoria, would not have sent an email. She would have picked up the phone and asked my father directly, "Richard, what the hell is going on?" A seed of pure, unadulterated panic had just been planted in the mind of Richard Jenkins. And for the first time in a very long time, he couldn't blame it on his quiet, detail-oriented daughter. He had received a warning from someone whose instincts he respected as much as his own. The calm, confident facade of Jenkins Holdings shattered that afternoon. The change in the office atmosphere was immediate. My father, who usually projected an aura of breezy, in-control leadership, was suddenly a storm cloud of tension. He was short-tempered, pacing his office like a caged lion. He barked Kevin and James Wilson into his office, slamming the door behind them. This time their voices were loud enough to carry. The calm tones of executive discussion were replaced with the sharp, ugly sounds of panic. "What do you mean you don't know?" I heard my father roar, his voice muffled but furious. "These are your approved vendors, Kevin. Your signature is on every single one." "They looked fine on paper, Dad." Kevin's voice was high-pitched, cracking with defensive panic. "The paperwork was all in order. It's not my job to be a private detective. You told me to be decisive." The door flew open, and James Wilson, the CFO, practically stumbled out, his face ashen. He looked like he was going to be sick. He rushed past my desk without a word, heading straight for the men's room. My father stood in the doorway, his tie loosened, his silver hair a mess. His wild eyes scanned the office until they landed on me. For a fleeting second, I saw something I had never seen in him before, a desperate, drowning look. He was in over his head, and he knew it. But his pride, the massive, towering fortress of his ego, would not let him ask for my help. He wouldn't give me the satisfaction. Instead, he did what all powerful men do when they're cornered and afraid. He tried to control the narrative. He would get ahead of the problem. He would bring in outsiders, not to find the truth, but to create the appearance of due diligence. He would hire an army to produce a piece of paper he could wave in Victoria Adams' face. He called an emergency all-hands meeting late that afternoon. The mood was somber. Everyone knew something was wrong. "Team," he announced, his voice straining to sound calm and presidential, "as part of our ongoing commitment to transparency and industry best practices, and to reassure our most valued partners." He was talking directly about Victoria. "I've made the executive decision to bring in a top-tier external auditing firm for a routine review, just to ensure all our new agile processes are functioning at the highest level." He was lying, and everyone in the room knew it. This wasn't routine. This was a 5-alarm fire. He glanced at me as he said it, a subtle, almost imperceptible challenge in his eyes. He was daring me to contradict him, to call him out. I held his gaze. My face was a mask of calm neutrality. I said nothing. My black binder, my 23-page truth bomb, was locked safely in my desk drawer. The weapon was forged. The battlefield was being prepared. And my enemy was so arrogant, he was unknowingly inviting the judges who would condemn him. Let him bring in his auditors. Let him spend a fortune on them. They would only confirm what I already knew, and his decision to hire them would make my eventual revelation all the more devastating, because it wouldn't just be my word against my family's. It would be my word validated by the very experts he had brought in to prove me wrong. The irony was so thick, so perfect, it was almost beautiful. The external auditors were exactly what you'd expect for the price my father was paying. They were from a top-tier firm, a team of 3 young, hyper-focused sharks, led by a man named Daniel Parker. Parker was in his 50s, a seasoned veteran with pale, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through corporate nonsense. He moved with a quiet, unnerving confidence. When they arrived on Thursday morning, they didn't waste time with pleasantries. They set up their laptops in the main conference room, the fishbowl, and transformed it into their war room. My father put on his best, welcoming, transparent CEO performance. "Daniel, my friend, welcome," he boomed, shaking Parker's hand a little too enthusiastically. "Whatever you need, just ask. We're an open book here at Jenkins Holdings." Kevin, trying to emulate him, was even worse. He leaned casually against the doorframe, trying to look like a peer. "Yeah, guys, feel free to poke around," he said with a cocky grin. "You'll find we run a pretty tight ship. My fast-track vendor system has really boosted our quarterly efficiency. The numbers speak for themselves." Daniel Parker just looked at him, his expression completely unreadable. "We'll see," he said, his voice flat. Then he turned and closed the conference room door, shutting them inside. The next 48 hours were a masterclass in psychological torture. The silence that emanated from that conference room was more menacing than any shouting match. The auditors worked with a quiet, relentless intensity. We could all see their silhouettes through the frosted glass, heads bent in concentration, fingers flying across keyboards. Every so often, one of the junior auditors would emerge, walk to the finance department, and return with a cart full of financial records, the physical copies of the same documents I had already digitized and analyzed. They were painstakingly retracing my steps, but they were doing it blindfolded and on the clock. The tension began to fray my father's nerves. His confident facade crumbled away, revealing the terrified man beneath. He paced his office like a caged animal. He snapped at his assistant, Sarah, for the coffee being too cold. His gaze kept darting from the conference room to his phone and then to me, sitting silently in my cubicle. It was like he was trying to solve a puzzle, and the two most important pieces, the external audit and his banished daughter, were right in front of him. But his pride wouldn't let him connect them. Kevin dealt with the pressure differently. He went into denial, projecting an air of bored indifference. He'd complain loudly to anyone who would listen. "This is such a colossal waste of money. We could have hired a new marketing director for what this is costing," he'd say, loud enough for the auditors to potentially overhear. All this disruption for a routine checkup. He was a man whistling past a graveyard, trying to convince himself the ghosts weren't real. "I just did my work. I kept my head down. I answered the emails that came my way, but my focus was elsewhere." The black binder in my desk drawer felt like it was radioactive, humming with a dangerous energy. The temptation to just end the suspense, to walk into that conference room and slap it down on the table, was a physical ache. But I resisted. My timing had to be perfect. My father had to be at his most desperate. His defenses had to be completely shattered. That moment arrived at 4 p.m. on Friday afternoon. An email from Daniel Parker landed in the inboxes of my father, my mother, James Wilson, and Kevin. Subject and meeting request. Body. Mr. Jenkins's office in 10 minutes. Then, a second later, my own inbox pinged. It was from Parker's assistant. Subject name, meeting request. Body. Mr. Parker respectfully requests you join the meeting as well, Ms. Jenkins. It was a quiet little earthquake. Everyone on the executive floor saw the email notification pop up. They saw me receive it. The banished daughter, the irrelevant analyst, being summoned to the verdict. As I stood up from my desk, a profound silence fell over the entire office. Keyboards stopped clicking. Phones stopped ringing. Every eye was on me as I walked the long, lonely path to my father's office. This was it, the moment of truth. The atmosphere in my father's office was so thick with tension, it was hard to breathe. Daniel Parker and his team stood on one side of the mahogany desk, a small, unassuming file in Parker's hands. On the other side sat my father, my mother, a pale-looking James Wilson, and Kevin, who was fidgeting nervously with his tie. I stood slightly behind them, near the door, an observer at my own trial. "Richard," Daniel began, his voice calm, professional, and utterly devoid of emotion. It was the voice of a surgeon about to deliver a terminal diagnosis. "I'm not going to sugarcoat this. You have a significant multi-million-dollar problem. We have confirmed a highly organized and systematic fraud being perpetrated against your company." My mother let out a small, strangled gasp, her hand flying to her mouth. Kevin looked like he'd been struck by lightning. "We've tracked approximately $2.9 million in fraudulent payments made over the last 18 months, Daniel continued, his eyes fixed on my father. The money was siphoned out through a network of 3 shell companies posing as legitimate vendors. That's impossible," Kevin stammered, his voice cracking. "I approved those vendors. I saw the paperwork. It was solid." Daniel Parker turned his gaze to my brother, and for the first time, I saw a flicker of something other than professionalism in his eyes. It might have been pity. "The paperwork was expertly forged, son," he said gently, "and it was approved because your internal control system for new vendors has a hole in it big enough to drive a truck through." My father's face, which had been pale with fear, was now turning a deep, dangerous shade of red. His fists were clenched on his desk, his knuckles white. But his volcanic anger wasn't directed at Daniel Parker, the bearer of bad news. It wasn't even directed at Kevin, the source of the failure. It was directed at me. His eyes burning with a furious, irrational rage locked onto mine. He shot to his feet, his chair scraping violently against the floor. He pointed a trembling finger at me, his whole body shaking. "You," he snarled, his voice a low growl that seemed to vibrate through the room. "You knew. You were the goddamn head of Audit. You sat there in your corner and you watched this happen. Why didn't you warn us?" It was the accusation I had been waiting for, the one I had played over and over in my head. My mother, seeing her husband's rage, immediately jumped in, her voice shrill with righteous indignation. "He's right, Adabel. Your brother was new at this. You have years of experience. Your job was to protect him, to protect this family. You let him fail." Kevin, seeing his parents create a new villain, eagerly piled on. "Yeah, Adabel. What the hell is wrong with you? Were you trying to make me look bad? Is that it? Some kind of petty revenge because you got demoted?" They were a pack of wolves turning on the one they had already wounded, trying to tear me apart to distract from their own catastrophic failure. I stood there and took it. I let the poison of their accusations fill the room, let their desperate, ugly blame hang in the air until it was thick and choking. I let them empty their chambers completely. When their tirade finally sputtered out, a heavy, panting silence fell. Daniel Parker and his team just watched, their faces impassive, letting the ugly family drama play out. This was clearly no longer just a case of fraud for them. I took a slow, deliberate breath, letting it out just as slowly. "You're right about one thing, Dad," I said. My voice was quiet, but in the supercharged silence of the room, it carried like a gunshot. I was the head of Audit. "I was the head of Audit," I repeated, letting the past tense settle like dust on mahogany. "Until you fired me from the team 10 days ago." My father blinked, a flicker of confusion crossing his face. "You sat right there in that chair," I continued, gesturing toward his seat, "and told me the company needed someone with sharper instincts. You told me my way of thinking was obsolete." The deep red began to drain from his face, replaced by a blotchy white. He had forgotten. In his blind panic, he had completely, utterly forgotten his own words, his own actions. "You told me my concerns were no longer my job," I went on, my voice gaining steady strength. "And Kevin, you stood in front of the entire department and used my analysis as an example of scaremongering and a waste of time." Their expressions began to shift, from rage and self-righteousness to uncertainty, a flicker of doubt. "You all made it perfectly clear, publicly, that my input was not only unwelcome, it was a nuisance." I reached into the inner pocket of my blazer. My hand was perfectly steady. I pulled out the black binder. I walked forward, closing the distance between me and the mahogany desk, the barrier that had separated me from my father my entire life, and I placed the binder on the polished wood. It made a soft, definitive thud that echoed in the silent room. "But just because you told me it wasn't my job," I said, locking eyes with my father, "doesn't mean I didn't do it." He stared at the binder as if it were a live explosive. Kevin looked at it in utter confusion, a child trying to comprehend a complex machine. Daniel Parker, however, reacted instantly. He reached out and slid the binder across the desk. He opened it to the first page, the executive summary. His professional poker face finally cracked. His eyebrows shot up toward his hairline. He flipped to the next page, then the next. His eyes scanned the charts, the timelines, the damning bank records. He saw the printouts of Michael Thompson's lavish vacation photos next to the dates of the largest payments. He saw the detailed analysis of how Kevin's fast-track system had been exploited. He saw the copies of the shell company's fraudulent incorporation documents. "My God," he whispered, looking up, not at my father, but at me. The look in his eyes had transformed from professional curiosity to sheer, unadulterated professional respect. He turned to my father. "Richard," he said, his voice now filled with awe, This isn't just an analysis. This is a complete, multi-layered forensic investigation. Frankly, it's more comprehensive and detailed than our preliminary findings from the last 48 hours. He held up the binder. If you had this report 10 days ago, you could have prevented the last $250,000 of loss and had a ready-made, gift-wrapped case for the district attorney. He looked back at me. Whoever did this, he said, his voice quiet now, is the only reason you still have a company left to save. My father collapsed back into his chair as if his strings had been cut. He looked like he'd been punched in the gut. He stared at me, his mouth slightly open, his face a canvas of disbelief, shock, and dawning horror. The powerful, arrogant CEO was gone. In his place was just a man, face to face with the catastrophic consequences of his own pride. Kevin, desperate and cornered, made one last pathetic attempt to save himself. But she never said anything, he stammered, pointing at me. She hid it. She was trying to sabotage me. She wanted me to fail. And that's when the final, unexpected nail was hammered into his coffin. It came from the quietest, most overlooked person in the room. Sarah, my father's mousy, middle-aged assistant, who had been standing nervously by the door, ready to take notes, cleared her throat. Her voice was trembling, but it was clear and steady. "Excuse me, sir," she said, looking at my father, but her words were aimed at Kevin. That's not entirely true." All eyes in the room snapped to her. She flinched under the sudden attention, but held her ground. "Last week," she continued, her courage growing with every word, "I saw some of those same invoices from Innovate on Mr. Thompson's desk when I was delivering his mail. The amount seemed high, so I brought them to Mr. Kevin's attention." She looked directly at my brother now. "He told me, and I remember his exact words, 'Don't bother me with the trivialities, Sarah. That's why we have managers.' Then he asked me to get him a coffee." The silence that followed was absolute. It was profound. It was devastating. Sarah's words were the final objective confirmation. The kill shot. It wasn't just my professional warning Kevin had ignored. He had ignored a direct verbal warning from his own father's trusted assistant. He had no more lies. He had no more excuses. He had nowhere left to hide. I looked at my family, a tableau of ruin. My mother was staring at Kevin, her expression of blind adoration finally shattering, replaced by a look of confusion and deep, painful disappointment. Kevin looked like a cornered animal, his face pale and sweating, completely exposed. And my father just looked old. He had wanted sharper instincts. He had lauded flair and vision. And in his quest for a child who reflected his own idealized image, he had thrown away the one person who embodied the single most important principle in finance, the principle upon which he had built his entire fortune: due diligence. The moments after Sarah's quiet, devastating testimony were a blur of controlled corporate chaos. The raw, messy family drama evaporated in an instant, replaced by the cold, sharp-edged reality of a legal crisis. Daniel Parker, seeing the situation had escalated beyond a simple audit report, immediately took charge. "Richard," he said, his voice firm and clear, leaving no room for argument or emotion, "you need to call your lawyer right now." My father just stared blankly, still reeling from the shock. It was my mother who reacted, fumbling in her purse for her phone to call Rachel Green, our company's head counsel. Rachel arrived in less than 20 minutes. She was a powerhouse, a woman in her late 30s with a mind like a steel trap. She walked into the office, took one look at the shattered expressions on my family's faces, at the black binder sitting on the desk, and at Daniel Parker's grimly professional demeanor, and her entire being shifted into high gear. The air, already thick with tension, now crackled with a new, terrifying energy. The energy of litigation. "All right," Rachel said, her voice cutting through the stunned silence like a scalpel. "First things first, nobody touches anything. I want the procurement department sealed off. All computers are to be locked down immediately. All files, physical and digital, are to be preserved. No one deletes a single email." She turned to Daniel Parker. "Mr. Parker, I'll need a full copy of your preliminary report and any supporting documentation." Then she pointed a pen at James Wilson, the CFO, who looked like he'd aged 20 years in the last hour. "James, I need a complete, verified list of every single payment made through the fast-track system since its inception. I want it on my desk by morning." Finally, her sharp gaze fell upon us, the family. Her expression was devoid of any sympathy. "For the Jenkins family," she said, her tone firm, Until we have a much clearer picture of the company's legal exposure here, my official advice as corporate counsel is that you do not discuss the specifics of this case with each other at all. Anything you say, even at the dinner table, could be subject to discovery in a potential lawsuit or federal investigation. That was, in its own way, the most shocking blow of the afternoon. We were a dysfunctional, fractured family, but we were still a family. Now we were being legally designated as a collection of potential co-conspirators and material witnesses. We were being told not to speak to one another. The invisible walls that had always existed between us had suddenly become real, tangible things, enforced by the threat of lawyers, depositions, and subpoenas. The process began immediately. 2 of Rachel's associates arrived and began working with IT to secure the servers. Michael Thompson was summoned back to the office under a false pretext. I saw him walk toward the HR department, a confused look on his face. 10 minutes later, he was escorted from the building by a security guard carrying a small cardboard box with his personal effects. He didn't make a scene. He just looked bewildered, like a man who had won the lottery for 18 months and couldn't believe his ticket had just been declared void. The sight of him being led away like a common criminal sent a ripple of palpable fear through the entire office. The rumor mill, already churning, went into overdrive. The company was no longer just a place of work, it was a crime scene, and no one knew who might be implicated next. A week passed. It was the longest, most surreal week of my life. The office was a ghost town of whispers and nervous glances. The family, for once, followed the lawyer's orders to the letter. We lived in the same large house, but we moved around each other like strangers in a hotel. We passed in the hallway without making eye contact. We ate meals at different times. The silence was thick with unspoken accusations, regrets, and fear. My mother spent most of her time in her room. Kevin was a ghost, rarely seen, and my father, he just seemed broken, a king wandering the halls of his conquered castle. The negotiation for my future didn't happen in his office over a conciliatory drink. It happened in the soulless, sterile environment of Rachel Green's conference room downtown, a place that smelled of expensive leather and corporate law. The setting was intentional. This was not a family matter. This was a business transaction. I sat on one side of the long, polished table. My sister Sophia sat beside me. She had insisted on coming, not just as my sister, but as my advisor and my witness. She had helped me prepare for this moment, reminding me of my worth and my leverage. On the other side of the table sat my father, looking small and defeated behind the vast expanse of wood. Rachel Green sat beside him, her role clear, to protect the company's interests, even from its founder. My father started, his voice heavy, tired. "Adabel, we need you. We need you to come back to fix this." The old me, the daughter who had spent her life craving her father's approval, would have melted right there. The old me would have been satisfied with just hearing those words of validation. But the woman who had been publicly humiliated, the woman who had spent 3 sleepless nights building a case against her own company, that woman had been forged into something harder, something less forgiving. I didn't respond directly to my father. I looked at Rachel Green. "Before we discuss my potential role in the company's recovery," I said, my voice calm and steady as if I were discussing a quarterly report, "we need to discuss the conditions of my return. My involvement is not guaranteed. It is conditional." Rachel, ever the professional, nodded. "Go on, Ms. Jenkins. We're listening." I slid a single sheet of paper across the table. It wasn't a long list of demands. It was a blueprint for a new structure, a new order. Sophia had helped me draft it the night before. "First," I said, my voice clear and unwavering, "the creation of a new independent executive position, Chief Integrity Officer. That will be my title. The CIO will report directly to the board of directors, not to the CEO." My father flinched as if I'd struck him. I was severing the very cord of authority he had held over me my entire life. He would no longer be my boss. In fact, in matters of compliance and control, I would be his superior. "Second," I continued, "the CIO will have full, unrestricted, and autonomous authority to overhaul all internal control, auditing, and financial approval processes. The fast-track system is to be dismantled by the end of this week. All financial approvals over $10,000 will require a 3-person electronic sign-off, including myself or a designated member of my new department. Third, I said, my gaze moving from Rachel to my father, Kevin will be reassigned to a non-financial, non-managerial role in a different city. He needs to learn this business from the ground up, without the safety net of his family name or his father's influence. This wasn't just about punishment, it was about risk mitigation. The company could not afford another liability like him in a position of power. This was a non-negotiable term for my promotion. It was also a bitter pill for my father to swallow. And finally, I said, taking a deep breath for the last, most personal condition, there will be a formal, company-wide announcement drafted by me and approved by the board. It will state that the discovery of the multi-million-dollar fraud and the implementation of the recovery plan were the direct result of my independent investigation. The narrative that I had been sidelined for a lack of instinct needed to be publicly, definitively, and permanently corrected. It wasn't about ego. It was about rebuilding a broken culture. The employees needed to see, in no uncertain terms, that competence was now valued above connections. That truth mattered more than family ties. My father picked up the single sheet of paper. He read the 4 points, his hand trembling slightly. It was a complete surrender, a dismantling of the nepotistic empire he had so carefully constructed. He looked up at me, and his eyes weren't angry anymore. They were filled with a look of weary, profound resignation. He knew he had no choice. The company's survival, its reputation with clients like Victoria Adams, and possibly his own freedom from legal trouble all depended on his answer. He looked at Rachel. His silent plea for an alternative was met with a slight professional shake of her head. The terms were not only reasonable from a corporate governance standpoint, they were necessary. "All right, Adabel," my father said, his voice barely a whisper, the words tasting like defeat. All right. I had won. I had gotten everything I wanted. But as I sat there in that cold, impersonal room, it didn't feel like a victory celebration. It felt like the signing of a treaty after a long and brutal war. I had won my seat at the table, but I had to burn down the family home to get it. And I wasn't sure yet if it had been worth the price. 6 months later, Jenkins Family Holdings was not only still standing, it was stronger and healthier than it had been in years. As the new Chief Integrity Officer, I had been relentless. I had done exactly what I promised. I tore down the old lax systems and rebuilt our internal controls from the bedrock up. The new processes were transparent, rigorous, and as close to foolproof as humanly possible. I promoted Elena Rodriguez, the sharp-eyed head accountant who had given me that silent nod of encouragement, to be my deputy. Together we were a formidable team, and we quickly restored a sense of order, accountability, and trust to the company's battered finances. The board of directors treated me like a savior. Our clients, reassured by the decisive and public changes, had all remained loyal. Victoria Adams had even taken me to lunch, a gesture of respect she had never extended to Kevin. From a purely business perspective, my rise had been a resounding, unqualified success. But the family was a different story. The formal legal lockdown had ended months ago, but the emotional one persisted. Our large, beautiful house had become a battlefield of passive aggression and icy silence. We were living in a Cold War, with the dinner table as our nightly demilitarized zone. My mother was the coldest front of all. She was meticulously civil to me, asking if I wanted coffee in the morning, with the same detached politeness she would use with a visiting repairman. The warmth that had once been reserved exclusively for Kevin was now gone entirely, replaced by a brittle, resentful formality. In her eyes, I was the villain of the story. I had not saved the company. I had destroyed her family. I had publicly humiliated her golden child. And that was a sin she could not forgive. She never asked about my day. She never acknowledged my new title. She simply acted as if I were a boarder temporarily staying in her son's old room. Kevin was in exile. As per the conditions of my return, he had been reassigned to a junior marketing support role at our small satellite office in Chicago. It was a humbling, almost cruel fall from grace. We hadn't spoken a single word to each other since the day of that fateful meeting. According to Sophia, who checked in on him periodically, he was miserable. He was living in a small, cramped apartment, doing work he considered deeply beneath him. And for the first time in his charmed life, he had no one to blame for his failures but himself. My father, the deposed king, was a ghost in his own company. He had officially stepped back from all day-to-day operations, retaining only the ceremonial title of chairman. He would sometimes wander the halls of the office, his shoulders slumped, looking lost and irrelevant. We had our required weekly meetings, but they were formal, stiff, and painful. The easy, if condescending rapport we'd never really had was now replaced by a vast, silent chasm of regret and unspoken words. The company was healing, but the family was festering with a deep septic wound. The first sign of a thaw came from the one person who had been my constant ally, Sophia. She had thrived in the new structure, her genuine talent no longer overshadowed by Kevin's bluster. She had been promoted to Chief Operating Officer, and we worked together seamlessly. She was the heart of the new Jenkins Holdings, and I was its brain. She called me late one Tuesday night. "I'm flying to Chicago this weekend to check on the branch office," she said, her voice casual, but I knew her better than that. "I think you should come with me." "Why?" I asked, my voice flat. "He doesn't want to see me, Sophia. You know that." "Maybe," she said gently, "but I think he needs to. He's been seeing a therapist, Adibel. His boss told me he's actually trying. He's quiet. He's doing the work. He's different." I was deeply reluctant. The idea of facing Kevin again felt like voluntarily touching a hot stove. But I trusted Sophia's judgment more than my own. That Saturday, I found myself in a small, generic coffee shop in a windy Chicago neighborhood, sitting across a small table from my brother. He looked diminished. The expensive suit was gone, replaced by a simple sweater. He was thinner, and the arrogant, confident smirk that had been his defining feature was completely gone, replaced by a permanent look of exhaustion. The silence between us was heavy and suffocating. Finally, he spoke. His voice was so low I had to lean in to hear him. He was staring into his black coffee as if it held the secrets of the universe. "I hated you, you know." I just nodded, my own throat too tight to speak. "I know," I finally managed to say. "My whole life," he continued, his voice cracking with a bitterness that was raw and real. "Everything was always so easy for you. The grades, the numbers, the analysis. You never seemed to have to try." He paused, looking up at me with eyes I barely recognized, eyes that weren't defensive or smug, but hollow and exposed. "But Dad was always pushing your report cards in my face, asking why I couldn't be more focused, more like you. He paid for tutors to help me with math, but he never praised me when I finally got a B. He just asked why it wasn't an A like yours." He took a shaky breath. "So I just gave up. I decided to be everything you weren't. I became the ideas guy, the people person. I built this whole personality, this entire brand, around being the charming, confident son. I was so desperate for him to finally be proud of me, for something, for anything." Kevin gave a humorless laugh. "And when I finally thought I had something that made me more valuable than you, Fast Track, my grand invention, he gave me the keys. And I ran with it. God, I ran with it so hard I didn't even stop to look back." He paused again, then said quietly, "And I almost ran the company off a cliff." I didn't say anything. There wasn't anything to say. I just let the silence settle, letting the weight of his words fill the space between us. He looked up again, and this time his eyes met mine directly. "I deserved what happened," he said. "You were right to do it. You saved us, and you didn't even rub it in." "I didn't want to save you," I admitted, my voice soft. "I wanted to protect what Dad built, and I wanted the people who actually work hard in that company to still have jobs in 6 months. That includes you, even if you didn't deserve it at the time." He gave a slow nod, absorbing that. "I know you probably don't want to hear this, but I'm sorry, Adibel. I really, really am." The sincerity in his voice caught me off guard. For years, I had imagined what an apology from Kevin might sound like. In my mind, it had always been too little, too late, and too drenched in ego to matter. But this version, quiet, broken, and stripped of all pride, was something else entirely. I wasn't ready to forgive him. Not fully, not yet. But for the first time, I could see a version of the future where maybe, someday, I might. We parted ways that afternoon with a hug. It was awkward, stiff, but real. It wasn't the kind of hug that wiped away a lifetime of rivalry and resentment, but it was a beginning. Back in New York, the company continued to evolve. Jenkins Family Holdings became known in the industry, not just as a survivor of scandal, but as a case study in ethical rehabilitation. We earned back trust not with flashy PR campaigns, but with consistency, humility, and measurable change. 1 year later, I was invited to speak at a financial ethics conference in Washington, D.C. I stood on stage in front of 500 professionals, talking about internal controls, whistleblower protection policies, and the importance of empowering employees at all levels. But somewhere in the middle of my prepared remarks, I paused. I looked out over the audience and said, "Sometimes the greatest threat to a company doesn't come from competitors or hackers or market volatility. It comes from the people you trust most. And sometimes protecting what matters means standing up to those people, even if they share your last name." That line made its way into a dozen trade journals and LinkedIn posts. But for me, it wasn't just a talking point. It was the truth I had lived. On a warm spring evening, nearly 2 years after that fateful October, I found myself standing on the back porch of the house I had bought for myself. Not the family house, not the company apartment. Mine. It was modest but elegant. A small garden, a wraparound porch, and a 2-car garage where I kept a vintage motorcycle I'd finally finished restoring. Peace, for me, still smelled like hot metal, old wood, and the sharp tang of WD-40. Sophia was over for dinner, as she often was. We had just finished a meal of grilled salmon and wine, and we were watching the sunset in companionable silence. "You're quieter than usual," she said. "I was just thinking about Dad," I admitted. "He called last week, asked if I'd have lunch with him." She raised an eyebrow. "And?" I said yes. "Wow." She leaned back, exhaling. "Do you think he's changed?" I shrugged. "I think he's trying. Or maybe he's just lonely. Either way, I'm not doing it for him. I'm doing it for me. I want to know if we can build something, not as CEO and daughter, just as people." Sophia nodded. "That's fair. You deserve that chance." A beat passed. "Do you ever think about how different things could have been if you hadn't come back to the office that day?" she asked. I smiled faintly. "Every now and then, but mostly I think about how different things are because I did." She raised her glass. "To doing the hard thing." I clinked mine against hers. "To doing the right thing." As the sun dipped below the trees, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time. Not victory, not vindication, not even peace. Just freedom. I was no longer the daughter, desperately seeking validation. I was no longer the woman pushed aside by arrogance and nepotism. I was Annabelle Jenkins. I had built something honest out of wreckage, and this time it was mine.